Snow had been falling since early morning, the kind of soft, patient snow that didn't rush to cover the ground, but seemed to settle thoughtfully on rooftops, windowsills, and bare tree branches, as if the town itself were being tucked in for the winter. And in the small town of Willowbrook, this snowfall marked the quiet arrival of Christmas Eve, a day when even the busiest people moved a little slower, spoke a little softer, and looked up from their worries, just long enough to notice the glow of lights reflected in the white streets. At the edge of the town stood a narrow bookstore called Hearth and Pages, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside, and its door decorated with a simple wreath tied with a faded red ribbon. And every year, without fail, the bookstore stayed open late on Christmas Eve. Not because it made much money that day, but because its owner, an elderly woman named Margaret, believed that stories were especially important when the year was coming to a close. She had learned this belief long ago, during a winter when she herself had nowhere else to go, when a book and a quiet room had been the only things that made the world feel gentle again. Inside the shop, the air smelled faintly of old paper, cinnamon tea, and pine from a small Christmas tree placed near the counter, its ornaments mismatched and clearly collected over many decades. Tiny wooden stars, glass bells with hairline cracks, and handwritten tags bearing names of people who no longer lived in Willowbrook, but were still remembered there. A small radio played carols softly in the background, never loud enough to intrude, just enough to remind anyone listening that this night was different from others. As evening approached, the doorbell chimed and a boy stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat and looking around as if he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to be there. His name was Oliver, and he had recently moved to town with his father after a long, difficult year that neither of them liked to talk about. Christmas for Oliver had begun to feel less like a celebration and more like a reminder of things that were missing. And yet something about the warm light of the bookstore had pulled him in from the cold, almost without him realizing it. Margaret noticed him immediately, not in the way adults sometimes stare at children, but in the quiet way of someone who had learned how to see people without making them uncomfortable. She smiled and asked him if he was looking for a gift or a story, and Oliver hesitated before answering honestly that he didn't really know. Margaret nodded as if this made perfect sense, and invited him to walk with her through the narrow aisles, where shelves leaned slightly and books seemed close enough to whisper to one another. She stopped in front of a small section labeled Winter Tales and pulled out a book with a blue cover worn smooth at the edges, explaining that some stories weren't meant to fix things or teach lessons, but simply to keep you company for a while. And Oliver felt something loosen in his chest as he held the book, realizing that for the first time in months, he wasn't trying to be brave or strong. He was just standing in a warm place, holding a story on Christmas Eve. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and one by one, people passed the bookstore window. Couples carrying wrapped gifts, neighbors stopping to talk beneath street lamps, a delivery driver humming along to the radio, and for a moment, all of their separate lives seemed connected by the same quiet understanding that this night mattered. Not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. When Oliver finally left, the book tucked carefully under his arm, Margaret slipped a small handwritten note inside the cover that simply read, "You are not late. You are exactly where the story needs you." Later that night, as the town grew still and the snow reflected the moonlight like scattered stars, Oliver sat by a window at home, reading while his father slept on the couch nearby. And for the first time in a long while, Christmas didn't feel heavy or complicated. It felt small, gentle, and kind, like a story that didn't demand anything from you except that you stay and listen. And somewhere across town, Margaret turned off the lights in the bookstore, the tree glowing softly in the dark, confident that even after the door was locked, the warmth of stories would keep traveling from page to page, house to house, heart to heart, just as it always did, especially at Christmas. Christmas morning arrived quietly in Willowbrook, not with excitement or noise, but with a kind of peaceful patience, as if the town itself were stretching awake after a good night's sleep. And the snow that had fallen so steadily the day before now lay untouched and smooth, turning every street, fence, and rooftop into something that looked carefully arranged rather than accidental. The sky was pale and clear, and sunlight reflected off the snow so brightly that it felt like the day was smiling without trying too hard. Oliver woke before his father, wrapped in the soft silence of the early morning. and for a moment he simply lay there listening to the distant sound of someone shoveling snow, to the slow rhythm of breathing from the living room, to the quiet hum of a house that felt, perhaps for the first time since moving, like it belonged to them. The book from the bookstore rested on the nightstand beside him, its blue cover catching the light, and he reached for it instinctively, as if it were something that had always been there rather than something new. In the kitchen, Oliver found his father standing by the window, holding a mug of coffee with both hands and watching the snow-covered street as though it were telling him something important. They exchanged a simple, "Merry Christmas," neither of them forcing cheer into the words, and somehow that made it feel more real. There were no elaborate decorations, no large pile of gifts, just a small tree in the corner with white lights and a few ornaments they had unpacked at the last moment. But the room felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the heater. Later that morning, bundled in scarves and gloves, Oliver and his father walked through town, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. And as they passed the bookstore, Oliver slowed down, noticing that although the door was closed, the lights inside were on, and the Christmas tree still glowed gently in the window. A handwritten sign hung beneath the wreath, reading, "Open for anyone who needs a story today." Inside, Margaret was arranging chairs in a small circle near the back of the shop, setting out cups of tea, and a plate of simple cookies dusted with powdered sugar. And when she saw Oliver, she greeted him not with surprise, but with recognition, as if she had expected him all along. She explained that every Christmas morning, she hosted a quiet reading hour for anyone who preferred listening to stories over unwrapping gifts, because some people celebrated best by sitting together and sharing something small and human. One by one, others arrived, a young woman far from home, an elderly man who had lost his wife years before but still wore her scarf, a tired nurse coming off a night shift. No one asked questions or explained themselves. They simply sat, warmed their hands on teacups, and listened as Margaret began to read, her voice steady and kind, turning the pages slowly, allowing the room to breathe between sentences. As Oliver listened, he realized that the story wasn't extraordinary in any obvious way. It didn't have magic spells or dramatic twists, but it spoke about ordinary moments, about people helping one another without keeping score, about time passing and leaving space for new beginnings, and somehow that made it feel more powerful than any grand tale he could imagine. He glanced at his father and saw him smiling softly, not in sadness, but in recognition, as if he too was finding something he hadn't known he was looking for. When the reading ended, no one rushed to leave. People lingered, exchanging quiet words, refilling cups, sharing names without histories. And when Oliver finally stepped back outside, the cold felt different, less sharp, less lonely. He understood then that Christmas wasn't a single day or a perfect moment, but a collection of small, gentle choices people made to be present with one another, even when life felt unfinished. And as the bells in town rang out the late morning hour, their sound drifting softly over the snow, Oliver carried the story with him. Not just the one in the book, but the one unfolding around him, knowing that some gifts didn't come wrapped at all, and that sometimes the truest warmth of Christmas arrived not in what you received, but in what you quietly shared.
The days after Christmas passed in a way that felt different from ordinary time, as if the space between one year and the next had softened the sharp edges of everything, allowing moments to stretch and settle without urgency. And in Willowbrook, this in-between season was marked by quiet routines, snow being shoveled at a thoughtful pace, shop windows still glowing with lights even though the holiday had technically passed, and people lingering in conversations they might normally rush through. For Oliver, those days became filled with small rituals he hadn't known he was missing. Each morning, he stopped by the bookstore on his walk through town, sometimes just to stand near the window and read the handwritten notes Margaret changed daily, short lines from poems, gentle reminders, or simple questions like, "What are you hoping for today?" And though he didn't always have an answer, the act of thinking about it made his steps feel lighter. Inside, Margaret would nod at him over her glasses, never interrupting his thoughts, always understanding that some visitors came for silence rather than words. At home, Oliver and his father began to fall into a new rhythm. They cooked simple meals together, rediscovering familiar recipes and inventing new ones by accident, and in the evenings they sat near the window, the book open between them, taking turns, reading aloud, sometimes stopping in the middle of a sentence just to talk about memories that surfaced unexpectedly. Stories from before Willowbrook, from a life that felt distant but not gone. These conversations didn't fix anything or wrap grief up neatly, but they made room for it, and that seemed to be enough. One afternoon, a heavy snowfall returned, blanketing the town once more, and Margaret closed the bookstore early, posting a sign that read, "Closed for weather, open for warmth." Instead of locking the door completely, she invited those already inside to stay, offering tea, spare blankets, and a place to wait out the storm. And as the snow thickened outside, strangers became companions by circumstance, sharing stories not because they were asked to, but because the quiet made it feel safe to do so. Oliver watched this from a corner of the shop, noticing how Margaret listened more than she spoke, how she remembered details without ever making them feel heavy, and he began to understand that the bookstore wasn't special because of the books alone, but because it had been shaped by years of patience, care, and the quiet belief that people deserved a place where they could simply exist without explanation. When the storm passed and the streets slowly reappeared, life in Willowbrook resumed, but something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Oliver found himself smiling at familiar faces, recognizing people he'd sat beside in silence just days before, and he realized that the town no longer felt like a temporary stop. It felt like a story he had stepped into midway, one that still had room for him. As the final days of the year approached, the bookstore prepared for its annual tradition, a New Year's Eve gathering where no resolutions were required, only reflections, and Margaret invited Oliver to help arrange the chairs and choose a passage to read at midnight. Holding the book in his hands, Oliver felt a quiet sense of belonging, knowing that whatever came next, whatever the new year held, he wasn't moving forward alone. And in that gentle space between what had been lost and what had not yet arrived, winter continued its slow work, teaching the town and the boy that some of the most important changes happened not with noise or celebration, but in the calm moments where warmth was shared and time was allowed to heal. Even after that quiet New Year's night faded into memory, the feeling it left behind did not disappear the way celebrations usually do. Instead, it settled gently into the ordinary days that followed, weaving itself into the routines of Willowbrook like an invisible thread that made everything feel slightly more connected. Winter remained firm in its place, snowbanks slowly hardening at the edges of the streets, but people greeted one another more openly now, as if the season had taught them that warmth was something you offered, not something you waited for. Oliver returned to school after the holidays with a different kind of steadiness. He still missed what had been lost, still carried questions he couldn't yet answer, but there was no longer a sense of being untethered. When difficult moments came, and they did, he thought of the bookstore, of the chairs arranged in a circle, of voices reading aloud without rushing, and he learned that comfort didn't always arrive as happiness. Sometimes it arrived as permission to feel exactly what you felt without needing to explain it. Hearth and Pages continued its quiet work. Margaret kept opening the shop every morning, brewing tea, writing notes for the window, and recommending books that seemed, almost mysteriously, to find the right readers at the right time. She never spoke of her role in the lives that passed through her door. But if one watched closely, it was clear that the bookstore had become something more than a business. It was a pause in the middle of life's sentences, a place where people could breathe before continuing on. As winter slowly loosened its grip and the first hints of spring appeared, thin streams of water running along sidewalks, the faint return of birdsong, Oliver and his father began planning small things together. A garden they might plant, a shelf they would build, a future that no longer felt intimidating simply because it was unknown. They learned that healing didn't mean forgetting or replacing what had been lost, but allowing something new to grow alongside it, patiently, at its own pace. And when the last traces of snow finally disappeared and the bookstore's wreath was replaced with fresh flowers in the window, Oliver noticed that the note Margaret had written that day read, "Stories don't end when the page does." He smiled when he saw it, understanding now that the story he had stepped into that Christmas wasn't finished. It never truly would be. Years later, Willowbrook would still remember that winter as an especially quiet one, though no one could quite say why it felt so important. But for Oliver, the memory would remain clear and warm. A snowfall, a bookstore, a story read aloud, and the realization that even in the coldest season, life had a way of leaving the light on. And so the story did not end with a celebration or a dramatic farewell, but with something softer and truer, with days continuing, with people choosing kindness in small ways, and with the understanding that some endings are not meant to close a door, but to leave it gently ajar, letting warmth, stories, and hope pass through whenever they are needed.